Hey everyone, welcome to the second video in my Advanced Guide 2 series. This time we're going over my absolute favorite fantasy to play, Wild Form. There's nothing I love more in my fantasy games than turning into animals, but a lot of the times this can lead to a very mechanically complex feature. I think DC20 does a better job at handling this than D&D 5e's Wild Shape, but there's still a lot to unpack, so let's get to it. Let's start by talking about casting Wild Form. Now, just to be very clear, Wild Form is not technically a spell, but it is an MP effect, so it can count as a spell for the purposes of spell duels or combo casting. That means you and your party of druids could have a fun time all channeling MP into a combo cast Wild Form, helping one of you become a much more powerful beast. The way it works normally though, without a party full of druids, is that you can spend 1 MP and 1 AP to turn into a Wild Form that you choose. And we'll talk later about the specifics of the Wild Form, but it's more something that you create and customize with a list of traits, rather than looking up a monster stat block. When you have a Wild Form, you can spend 1 AP to switch into your Wild Form from your True Form, or spend 1 AP to go from your True Form back to your Wild Form. Let's talk about these two forms, starting with the True Form. Nothing complicated here, the True Form is just who you are normally. It's all your character stats and abilities, it's just you when you're not in the form of a beast. This is the form you go back to whenever your Wild Form ends. So, instead let's get to the form with all the complexity, Wild Form. I'm going to talk about this piece by piece, pretty much working through the rules for Wild Form. So the first basic idea is when you turn into your Wild Form, you now use its HP pool instead of yours, and any damage you take in that form is taken from that HP pool. You do have to keep track of this separately, as the damage is maintained even as you switch back and forth between your True Form and your Wild Form. Now, the Wild Form will last an amount of time equal to your combat mastery, so half your level rounded up. And that Wild Form does end early though if it's ever reduced to 0 HP, so basically whichever one of these two conditions happens first. So why do I keep saying that Wild Form? Well, that's because you can have multiple forms. I find that this is the part of Wild Form that tends to confuse the people the most, but allows for really interesting gameplay. Let me be clear about what this is not. This is not saying that there are only ever two kinds of beasts you can turn into, like learning 2 spells from a spell list. I see this misconception pretty often. Instead, this is saying that when you use the 1 AP and 1 MP to get access to a Wild Form that you can switch into and out of, that you can actually do that again and have access to 2 Wild Forms that you can switch into and out of as you want, spending 1 AP to switch as I mentioned earlier in the video. Importantly, the 2 Wild Forms have to be different, so I can't just have 2 identical bear forms active at the same time. If you ever try to make a 3rd Wild Form, then you have to choose one of the 2 Wild Forms you currently have access to be replaced. Let me explain this with an example. Let's say combat starts and I'm in my True Form. On the first turn, I spend 1 AP and 1 MP to turn into a bear. Then I do a couple things as a bear, and then on my turn, I spend 1 AP and 1 MP again, while in bear form, to turn into a spider. Then I make an attack as a spider and spend 1 AP to turn back into the bear. Then on any of the next turns, I could spend 1 AP to switch to and from any of the forms I have access to. So in this case, True Form, Bear Form, and Spider Form. But now let's say I wanted to turn into a snake. Well, I would spend the 1 AP and 1 MP to create that form, but since I already have 2 other Wild Forms active, Bear and Spider, then I would have to choose either one of those to swap out for my new snake form. Hopefully that helped explain and clarify a little bit of how multiple forms work and the flexibility that's enabled by it. This means that unlike 5e, where you have to stay in your wild shape for the whole duration, in DC20 you can freely go into and out of any form you have access to, and even have access to up to 2 forms simultaneously. Okay, with that cleared up, let's talk about some of the more basic stuff, like equipment. When you turn into a Wild Form, your current equipment either falls to the ground or merges into your Wild Form, and you can choose which of these applies for each individual item. So while you probably can't use the items in your Wild Form, you can choose to have a particular equipped item fall to the ground for someone else to pick up, hopefully an ally. Any magic item you choose to merge into your Wild Form continues to give you their benefits, but you can't activate them or spend their charges. So basically passive magic item buffs continue to apply when you're in Wild Form. Meanwhile, your identity is the same in Wild Form. You're still the same individual, and your personality, intellect, and ability to speak are unaffected. Being in Wild Form doesn't give you the ability to speak with animals, but the Druid flavor feature can, and that would still apply while you're in Wild Form. Now we can get to the mechanical details of the Wild Forms you create, starting with your HP. All Wild Forms have a base HP of 2. There are ways to increase that I'll mention later, but that's the assumed starting HP. If your True Form takes any excessive damage or healing, the excess will go to the HP of your True Form. So if you get hit for 5 damage while in the form of a bear that has 2 HP, then your bear form takes 2 damage, and the remaining 3 damage goes to your true form. Or if you're at full HP in the bear form and get healed, all that healing will go to your true form instead. Now, one important note is the role of temporary hit points in all this. See, temporary hit points are applied to you as an individual. And like I mentioned in the personality section, you are the same individual even when you're in wild form. So really you should think of temporary hit points as taking the damage first, no matter which form you're in. And the temporary hit points doesn't depend on which form you're currently in. This means that spells like Fire Shield can help prolong the survivability of your wild forms. But the most important note here is that wild form doesn't have the HP to make it a strong combat option. That's likely going to be part of a subclass dedicated to enhancing wild form, but wild form can be an excellent utility tool. And even in combat, it can have some neat tricks, but as it is now, it's likely not going to live more than a few turns, at least assuming you stay in wild form for the whole time. What about your wild form's offenses though? Well, as a baseline, you have natural weapons. This means some part of your body, like your fangs or claws, deal 1 damage with their unarmed strikes. You can choose if that damage is bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage when you create that form. Now we can get to the area with a lot of nuance. Wild form's interaction with class features and talents. See, wild form doesn't benefit from any class features or talents that you have, except for druid class features. So that means you can still use things like druid domain or the wild speech flavor feature. On top of that, you also can't cast spells, including cantrips, or use techniques in wild form. However, maneuvers are currently allowed in wild form, so if you find a way to learn some maneuvers, you could use those while in your wild form. Another interesting note is that grip points are also allowed. Nothing about wild form prohibits them, so this can be a good way to help your wild form HP last longer if you need it. But keep in mind, grip points are a limited resource, so using them every time you take damage is likely going to make you run out of grip points very quickly. Alright, there is one other category of interaction that comes up because of how you create your wild form: ancestry traits. See, in wild form, you don't benefit from any of the ancestry traits of your true form. Instead, when you use that 1 AP and MP to create a wild form, you get 3 traits to spend on beast traits, meaning ancestry traits from the Beastborn list. Or you can put those trait points to an exclusive wild form trait list. I'll talk about that in a bit. You can also get 2 more trait points to spend for each additional 1 MP you spend when using the wild form ability. So if I use wild form for 2 MP and 1 AP, then I would get the 3 traits by default, and then 2 more for spending the extra MP, for a total of 5 trait points. An important thing to remember here though is the mana spend limit, meaning your wild form can't have more than 3 traits at levels 1 and 2, 5 trait points at levels 3 and 4, or 7 points at levels 5 and 6, and so on. Importantly, you can't take trait points that have a negative cost to gain points. So these trait points are a hard limit. You can't get more with negative traits. There are some consequences to this, like being unable to take a wild form with full flight until level 5, although gliding is still available at level 1, and limited flight is still available at level 3. I'll go over some of my own personal creations at the end of the video to show off some ideas of trait combinations, but there's plenty of creative builds you can make. Even just with the Beastborn traits, there are thousands of unique combinations that can be made. This is a really nice way to make incredibly customizable beasts without having to access the entire monster manual. So, let's take a look at the stat form for the stat block for wild form. This is the default stat block. The creature you create is always going to be a beast, but it can be a small or medium in size. The HP is 2, like we talked about before. The PD is calculated as 8 plus your combat mastery plus your prime, which is nice since the PD will scale with your prime. The MD is just the same as your true form MD. The wild form has no PDR by default, but it does have MDR equal to yours if you have any. The default speed is 5, and the wild form has the same masteries as you and the same prime as you. Its might and agility are both 1 by default, but its charisma and intelligence are both the same as your true form. And the wild form has the same save DC, attack checks, and spell check as you do. It also has the same save masteries as you do too, so that'll kind of work nicely with you having the attributes that you have. And finally, your wild form has the same AP as you do, and that's pretty much always going to be 4 AP. Alright, so before I show off some of my own unique wild form creations, let's go over those wild form traits. First off is the size trait, which is unique, meaning it can only be taken once. This lets you count as either tiny or large at the cost of 2 points. This basically extends the possible size categories by 1, since you can already be small or medium by default. Then the remaining traits all cost a single point and are repeatable, meaning they can be taken multiple times. Attribute increase lets you increase your might and agility or agility by 2, up to your attribute limit. Defensive lets you boost either your PD or MD by 2. Healthy gives you 1 more HP on the top of the 2 that you start with. Resistance gives you resistance 1 to a physical or elemental damage type of your choice. So basically it reduces the damage of that type that you take by 1. But remember, you can take this trait multiple times, so you could get resistance 3 to a specific damage type if you put all your trait points towards it at level 1. Skillful is interesting. It gives you skill mastery in 2 skills out of acrobatics, animal, athletics, awareness, intimidation, stealth, or survival. But the neat part is that if you're already at the mastery limit for the skill that you want to increase, it gives you advantage in that skill instead. This seems like a really cool way to use the trait, and allows you to make animals that really excel in one of these skills. Finally, there's Swift, which increases your speed by 1 space. And this is the only repeatable trait with a limit, letting you take it a maximum of 5 times, which would give your wild form a maximum of 10 speed of 10 spaces. Okay, let's get to the fun part, at least for me, showing off some of the animal builds, like the Armadillo. Now, just to be clear, the name is just flavor for all of these. If you want this to be a baby rhino, then go ahead. This is a simple build, just take the defensive trait 3 times for a total of 6 more PD, bringing you to 18 PD. If you already have good MD, then this can make you a really solid tank, except you do still have that 2 HP, so a strong hit could take you out. And this really goes to show that trying to use your wild form as a way to be defensive and tank damage is going to be very difficult, especially at those early levels. So let's go for a more utility build, like the Cheetah. This build is also really intuitive. Just take the Swift trait 3 times and bring your base speed up to 8. This could be a huge benefit in a kind of chase scene or similar high stakes, high speed scenario. It's not amazing at anything else, but this is the highest base speed that a level 1 character can achieve on their own, so that's neat. But for another neat movement trick, we have the Rabbit. So this one's a clever combo. Jumper gives you an additional 2 jump distance and lets you jump as a minor action. Then Strong Jump lets you get the benefits of a running jump without using movement. Finally, Attribute Increase for Agility increases your jump distance by an additional 2. This means you have a jump distance of 5, letting you move your whole movement in a single leap, without even needing to make a check or get a running start. Check out my skill-based actions video if you want a breakdown on the jump action and jumping rules. So, next I have 2 related forms, 2 kinds of spiders with totally different traits. First, I want to talk about the utility spider build. Here I took a bunch of the mobility traits, so the climb speed, spider climb, and web walk. Climb speed is a prerequisite for spider climb, so they come as a package deal. Now web walk here is very situational, but I thought it was on theme. You could easily swap it out for something else, especially if you want to represent another wall walking or wall climbing animal. Okay, so what if I wanted to build an offensive spider build? Well, here I would probably take shoot webs and venomous natural weapon. So you can basically trap an enemy in the webs and then try to poison them with your attacks, making it harder to break out of those webs. This might be one of the most powerful forms offensively out of the ones I'm mentioning, but it is squishy like all wild forms, so your best bet is to switch in and out of it, but that can also burn AP really quickly. As you get to higher levels, your mana spend limit increases, so you could even merge the 2 spider builds I just mentioned into a single build. Then I have an espionage build, the Rat. Taking the size trait can allow it to become tiny, letting you squeeze through small cracks and hide behind small objects. And then taking skillful in stealth and awareness. Now, assuming you're already at the skill mastery limit for both of these, it gives you advantage in awareness and stealth, further enhancing your espionage capabilities. An important note here is that Keen Sense can also give you guaranteed advantage on awareness checks with a single sense, regardless of your skill mastery. But if you're already at the mastery limit, then skillful in awareness can give you advantage on all awareness checks for cheaper, since it can also give you another skill to benefit from skillful. There's another build I made up that kind of takes advantage of skillful, and that's the Ape. The goal here is basically to make a competent grapple form. You can check out my grappling guide video for details on how to make a grapple, how to grapple, but the build is going to try to do this by taking advantage of an attribute increase for might, skillful in athletics and intimidation, and healthy for 1 more HP. Now, ideally I would get the size trait for huge, but that's too expensive for level 1, and it's getting me the same advantage that I would get from skillful in athletics. But skillful also gives me advantage in intimidation, which can be also very useful to secure grapples, giving enemies disadvantage on checks to resist the grapples while you have advantage to initiate those grapples. But at higher levels, adding the size for more advantage and being able to grapple larger targets would help. Alright, that pretty much wraps up my discussion for wild form. I can make this video much longer by just continuing to list wild form combinations, but I think the ones I've shown do a good enough job giving an idea of what might be possible with wild form. And I think importantly, serve as a good reminder that wild form can do a lot more for utility than as a pure combat feature. Druid can do much better for damage and general combat by just using their domain and casting spells, but sometimes you want to sneak into places as a rat, or climb walls as a spider, and that's what wild form excels at. I'd love to see what forms y'all come up with in the comments, so please include your own thoughts below. There's a lot of room to get creative with this feature, and that's one thing I really love about it. Hopefully this video helped clarify wild form and gave you an inspiration on how to use it. Thank you as always for watching the video, and until the next time, have the best time.